Over the past several decades, Islamist terror attacks have killed hundreds of people in Europe, with the year 2015 etched into the minds of many here in France. But since the fall of the Islamic State group in 2019, jihadism has largely ceased to be a leading concern of the public debate. We will be talking about it with today's prospective guest. Hugo Micheron is a researcher who's just published a book about the history of European jihadism. I'm pleased to welcome him on set. Hugo Micheron, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Your book is called La colère et l'oubli in French, or sort of anger and forgetting, or anger and oblivion in English. Is that sort of meant as a summary of European attitudes about its own terrorism threat?
Yes, I do think that part of the answer that democracy has produced to jihadism was peak of anger when the attacks campaign of ISIS, for instance, struck France or the UK or Germany, and they tend, as soon as the threat is actually declining, to forget the threat, to forget about jihadism. And I think it's not a purposeful response. It's not a long-term response. My point here is to say that jihadism cannot be reduced to attacks only. It has an ideology. It has some references, and therefore, we need to change the focus when ISIS, for instance, is destroyed, as it was in Syria and Iraq a few years ago. The ideology might remain, and it still is the case. We still see that there is tens of thousands ISIS fighters in Syria and Iraq now, but there is also some supporters in Europe, and therefore the question of what would jihadism become is very important, and this is basically changing the focus from a terror threat to a political and more societal questions.
Yeah, you talk about the fact that we tend to forget that terrorism is a means to an end.
Absolutely.
That's through that ideology, but what end are we talking about exactly?
Well, jihadism is using terrorist attacks to terrorize. That's the principle, right? It's a political end. You need to terrorize the enemy that you're targeting, which is the case. But when it comes to jihadists, they've been in Europe, they've been very clear about the objective from day one. In the first place, when they ended up reaching Europe in the 1990s, there were very few of them, right? We're talking about few dozens in Europe. But the stated goal at the time was to target enemies that were mostly Arab regime and the United States. And this sort of peaked in the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington. But after that, Europe became a target, and especially in the mid-2000s with the attacks in London and in Madrid. We saw that Europe was started to become a target because we had European involved in. So the project is always outside Europe. So for instance, in the 1990s, the project was to support the Taliban. In the 2000s, the project was to create an Islamic State in Iraq. And in the mid-2000s, 2010s, it was to produce a so-called Islamic Caliphate under the umbrella of ISIS. So there is a political goal outside Europe, but because Europe is perceived as an enemy of this, it has to be targeted as such. But it's also a pool of recruitment. And this is a new phenomenon. Since we have European involved, well, they tend to recruit in their surroundings. And hence, the evolution of European jihadist movement from a few dozens in the 1990s to 6,000 European involved in jihadi ranks in Syria and Iraq in the last decade.
Yeah, you talk about this sort of pattern of ebbs and flows,
Exactly.
A little bit, that what you just described. Now we would be considered in sort of an ebb period.
Yeah.
The last project you just mentioned was the Islamic State group Caliphate. That's what things were building towards. What's the project now?
Well, it's difficult to answer to that question because there is several competing projects within jihadi movements. You have, for example, one pattern or one model, which is that of the Taliban in Afghanistan. But you've got still ISIS, which is quite powerful and try to come back, or at least, display a propaganda saying they will eventually come back. So the project is not dead, and they just expect the right geopolitical opportunity to actually thrive again. Of course, all of this, have to be taken with a pinch of salt, because it doesn't mean it's going to happen. But what it means is that in the Heb period, they are not having the hand. They are waiting for the right moment, and this means they are not trying to develop attacks. So we need to change the way we approach things in the Heb period, because they are mostly concerned about recruiting, reconfiguring, and maybe developing new way to target European societies. For instance, based on my fieldwork in French prisons, I was really much surprised to hear like jihadi militants saying, we don't want to target France now. What we want is to recruit, because we're all in prisons at the moment, but we will eventually get out, and we will have to, wait for the right moment to be active. But they don't necessarily have the initiative. So what we should be very careful of is actually to look at the geopolitical situation. If you look at the 3 last decades that I've mentioned, jihadists have been very good at using crisis and basically became like sort of a using this crisis to thrive, for instance, but they never produced the crisis by themselves. For instance, in Iraq, they ended up creating a so-called Islamic State in the mid-2000s because there was the US invasion of Iraq. In the 2010s, ISIS developed as a so-called caliphate because there was an ongoing civil war in Syria that was massive and created like area where they could actually take over the power. So the way we should look at it is to observe whether there is some connections between a geopolitical crisis, and there is plenty of this, and the like European phenomenon. And this is quite obvious. I mean, we know when there is a new peak coming, such as the rise of the Taliban, for instance, is a good. We should be watchful of this. For the moment, let's say in the Heb period, we should be careful of what they are producing and what they're saying. And it's easy to monitor. It's online. It's in their official communications and so on.
All right, Hugo Micheron, it's so interesting, but I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you again so much for coming in today. A reminder, that's Hugo Micheron, author of the book La colère et l'oubli, which recounts the history of European jihadism.